Здравствуйте, как дела? Меня зовут TC McCarthy. I'm TC McCarthy. You've tuned into my channel, and today we're going to be talking about a Russian space disaster. But before we get going, let me remind you, I am the handsomest and most entertaining science fiction author on YouTube and on video. And don't forget, July 2019, my next book comes out, Tyger Burning. Pre-order it now. There's a video right here, pew, 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 that'll tell you why pre-ordering is so important. I'd really appreciate it. So what about this Soviet space disaster at Baikonur in Kazakhstan, I believe is where Baikonur is, but I could have that wrong. Maybe it's in Russia. And it involved a rocket, the R-16, a new rocket that was basically a ballistic missile and the brainchild of Soviet engineer and designer Mikhail Yangel. It was intended to replace the R-7, whatever that is. I'll try and put a picture of it here. Pew! And then this is the R-16. Pew, pew. And basically the R-16 was designed to use non-cryogenic fuels because that was more efficient and they could fuel it faster and launch it faster and all those sorts of things. Now the interesting thing is the fuels and oxidizers that they chose, UDMH, and I believe the other was a mixture of nitric acid and nitrogen tetroxide. Well, UDMH is a highly toxic material that actually has some nerve effects, and if you breathe some of that in, if you breathe enough of it in, it's going to kill you. Highly, highly toxic. And then the nitric acid blend that they used, if you got any of it on your skin, well, you can expect to be burned. It is incredibly toxic and caustic stuff. Neither one of those mixed together would you want to be around because the result would be an incredible explosion. So, although it would be more efficient, the actual mixture turned out to be incredibly dangerous, and Yangel knew this, but went ahead with it anyway. Now in charge of Yangel's boss was Air Marshal Nedelin. And he was commander of the USSR's strategic rocket forces, a very powerful man. And this air marshal wanted the rocket ready for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, so he was pushing hard for this thing to be developed quickly. And if there's anything you know from watching my series before on the Challenger and the Columbia disasters, the Soyuz disasters, anytime you push these programs faster than they're really intended to go, you wind up with disaster more often than not. And this time was no exception. And really, there was no point in pressuring him. Basically, the air marshal pressured them to the point where they ignored key safety measures. But even before he started pressuring, they were ahead of schedule. So it's not clear why this moron, Nedelin, or however you pronounce his name, pushed Yangel to the point where a catastrophe occurred. And they were competing against the kind of classic camp using cryogenic fuels for rockets. So there was an added pressure of competition between two teams. So Yangel attracted one of the best electricians or electrical engineers in the Soviet Union who began looking at the electronic systems of the R-16. But he couldn't get him. Because of the competition, he went to the other program, and instead Yangel was stuck with this dude, Boris Konoplyev. Now, this guy was brilliant, but not systematic. And you don't want somebody who's an inventive guy doing rocket programs necessarily. You want somebody who's going to be systematic and careful and go through the proper steps. Well, Konoplyev was not that kind of guy. He was an inventor. He was imaginative. He was an expert in radio engineering, but not the kind of guy you want to work on your rocket. And when he gave instructions, they were ambiguous. He just could not communicate with the team members. So one after another, there were technical glitches. Some of them got solved, some of them didn't. And so the electronics on this aircraft were not especially looking good as progress went forward. And by the time of their test launch, some of the team members had been working 72 hours straight trying to meet this deadline and trying to deal with all the electronics glitches. Now, during fueling procedures, all non-essential personnel are evacuated, but Yangel himself would set up a chair on the pad to make sure that everybody who was supposed to be there was there, and also to send a message that he wasn't scared, even though he himself knew all the dangers. And as it turned out, the rocket was fueled successfully. But instead of following the checklist after that point, there were a couple of seals that had to burst to send at a predetermined time to send the fuel into the engines and get ready for launch. But there were no sensors to tell the engineers whether or not those seals had burst as they were intended to. And so what Yangel ordered was for a technician to open up the rocket and crawl in and listen through one of the pipes. Actually, it was multiple technicians at multiple areas. Listen to the pipes to tell if fuel was actually flowing through them and going to the proper locations. But instead of hearing the fuel flowing, they heard a shock and a noise from the spacecraft and then a burning smell. And what had happened is that the first stage discs designed to cut off the gas generator hadn't burst. The second stage ones had burst instead. And miraculously, no one had been injured at this point, although they did find a small fuel leak. And they found problems with the control panel, the batteries, all sorts of things started to go wrong at this point, but still nothing had happened that was catastrophic. Now somebody high up recommended that they drain the rocket, basically neutralize it, and then send it back to the factory for repair and modification. But Nedelin, the air marshal, would have none of that, and he said, "We will correct all problems in situ on the pad." So these guys, already exhausted and taxed, worked all night to try and fix the problems. Wires were replaced and then they melted in place because they had short circuits and malfunctions. And the propellant engineers still weren't actually sure if the second stage discs had blown prematurely. So they tried to figure it out by going around and sniffing. Literally sniffing with their noses. And then finally on the evening of October 24th, it was time. And no longer trusting the electrical system to operate as intended, they manually ruptured the discs using a battery that they carried up a service ladder. And at T-minus 30 seconds, all these ladders were swarming with people trying to handle last-minute preparations for the launch that was coming. Now, some of the engineers, the lucky ones, decided to take a smoke break and went to a bunker to have some cigarettes. And that included Yangel. And according to another lead designer who had also decided to take a smoke break, these are his words in terms of what he saw. "When I went down to the bunker, I found the always calm and collected Machin and the missile crew chief in somewhat of an agitated state, which Alexander Sergeyevich explained, saying that Gregorians was putting tremendous pressure on him and always rushing. Continuing our conversation, we stopped by the smoking room and had a cigarette. I started to reassure him, uttering a bunch of platitudes. And suddenly at that moment we heard incomprehensible, chaotic, violent noises and explosions. Matren and I ran into the control room. Senior Lieutenant V.N. Taran, the preparation and launch control panel operator, and engineers from our design bureau whose responsibilities included monitoring the pre-launch circuit setup were there at that time. They looked horrible, ashen and wild-eyed. I dashed to the periscope and saw our missile burning on the launch pad. This hideous conflagration was accompanied by the explosions of the solid fuel-braking engines and the high-pressure tanks. Now, as it turned out, what had happened is that somebody had flicked a switch igniting the second stage unintentionally, and it was probably an electrical malfunction. Then that second stage, as it fired, it ignited the first stage, causing a tremendous explosion. A video camera had been set up to monitor the launch, but instead what it captured were bodies, shambling bodies of men trying to get away from, probably men and women, trying to get away from the rocket engulfed in flames. Those that didn't get engulfed in flames ran as far as they could, but were overcome by the fumes of the UDMH and the nitric acid mixture. And they got tangled in the wire. They had set up a perimeter to keep people out, but instead what happened was that it kept people in and killed a lot of people as they got caught and tangled in the wire, preventing them from escaping. The heat of the flames got so high, 3,000 degrees C, that it actually literally melted the roads. Now, there were also spectators on site. I think 100 engineers were there at the time, plus 150 spectators. And in the after-action investigations that didn't come out during the Soviet Union, but only after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was later discovered that somewhere around 150, possibly as many as 200 people died in this event. It was covered up so well that just a few months later, Russia celebrated when they launched their first man into orbit. Nobody really knew what happened. Relatives were told that their loved ones died in a plane accident. And today at Site 41 at Baikonur, which actually is in Kazakhstan, I remembered, today at that site where the launch mishap occurred, there's a marker to remember the 54 people who couldn't be identified. Well, that wasn't the first accident in Soviet space exploration history, and it wouldn't be the last. Now, technically it was a ballistic missile that blew up on the pad, but don't forget, these guys were riding ballistic missiles into orbit. So they were basically riding rockets that had been designed to carry nuclear weapons to the United States, instead using them to launch their cosmonauts into orbit. So these types of tests mattered and had an impact on the actual cosmonaut program. Thanks for watching. Remember to buy my book, pre-order it. It's coming out in July 2019, but that doesn't mean you can't buy it now, and I would really appreciate it. End transmission. Hey, T.C. McCarthy here, the most eclectic and entertaining science fiction author on YouTube, maybe even the internet. Thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. As usual, buy my books. I've got a new one coming out in July, and I'll have a giveaway coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. Appreciate you subscribing to my channel, and please, 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 please don't forget to click that little bell icon so that whenever I upload new content, you get notified. Thanks again. See you soon.